Well, it's 10 o'clock, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started here as more people start to join. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this exciting artist conversation. My name is Catherine Inerly, and on behalf of SOCO Gallery, we are looking forward to this talk this morning surrounding A Midnight Thing, which is an exhibition on view here at SOCO Gallery in Charlotte, North Carolina, that was curated by Lia Rose Newman and features the work of Bethany Collins, Allison Janae Hamilton, and Hong-Ân Trong. I am going to briefly introduce each of our speakers this morning, and then we can start our conversation. I will just note that Allison Janae Hamilton was unable to join us this morning, but she is a vital part of this exhibition, and it's been wonderful to have her work here. Bethany Collins is a multidisciplinary artist who received her BA in studio art and visual journalism from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa and her MFA in drawing and painting from Georgia State University in Atlanta. Collins is a two-time recipient of the Artadia Award, winner of the Hudgens Prize, and the recipient of a fellowship from the Illinois Arts Council. She has been selected for prestigious residencies, including at the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts, Omaha, Nebraska, the MacDowell Colony, Petersboro, New Hampshire, and McCall Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. Collins currently lives and works in Chicago, Illinois. Hong-Ân Trong is an artist who uses photography, video, and sound to explore immigrant, refugee, and decolonial narratives and subjectivities. She was a Guggenheim Fellow in Fine Art in 2019 through 2020 at the Cap State Artist in Residence at the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Art in 2020. She is a MacDowell Residency Fellow for 2022. Hong-Ân lives in Durham, North Carolina, where she is an activist and a teacher. She's a professor of art at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Lia Rose Newman earned her BA in art history and BFA in studio art from Winthrop University and her MA from Duke University. She has held the position of director and curator of the Van Every Smith Galleries at Davidson College since January of 2013, where she is responsible for curating exhibitions, developing exhibition-related programming, and overseeing and growing the college's art collection, including the campus sculpture collection. And so now I will pass it over to Lia to start our conversation.
Thank you. You all are such rock stars. Thanks for letting me have the opportunity to work with you. Thanks to Catherine Ann, everyone at SOCO, Chandra, Hillary, Gabby. Thanks to artists, including Allison, who, as Catherine Ann mentioned, isn't with us today, but also Hong-Ân and Bethany. And thanks for joining this morning. So the title of the exhibition and the concept for the show started actually from a few paragraphs in Zadie Smith's novel, White Teeth. I think the book is about 20 years old. And if you asked me to tell you all about the plot, I probably couldn't really recount that. I read it about 10 or 12 years ago. And there was this one section, though, that really stuck with me. And it has kind of resurfaced over the last few years. It would sort of come into my brain, particularly during challenging either like social, political moments, environmental catastrophe. And so I wanted to just read that because Zadie Smith's words are a lot better than mine. So the character that's speaking is Alsana. And she's sort of speaking about what it's like to live with looming disaster and moments of precarity. She says, to Alsana's mind, the real difference between people was not color, nor did it lie in gender, faith, and their relative ability to dance a syncopated rhythm or open their fists to reveal a handful of gold coins. The real difference was far more fundamental. It was in the earth, it was in the sky. You could divide the whole of humanity into two distinct camps as far as she was concerned, simply by asking them to complete a very simple questionnaire. A, are the skies you sleep under likely to open up for weeks on end? Is the ground you walk on likely to tremble and split? C, is there a chance, and please tick the box, no matter how small that chance seems, that the ominous mountain casting a midday shadow over your home might one day erupt with no rhyme or reason? Because if the answer is yes to one or all of these questions, then the life you lead is a midnight thing, always a hair's breadth from the witching hour. It's volatile, it is threadbare, it is carefree in the true sense of that term. It is light, losable like a keyring or a hair clip. And it is lethargy. Why not sit all morning, all day, all year under the same cypress tree, drawing the figure of 8 in the dust? More than that, it is disaster. It is chaos. Why not overthrow the government on a whim? Why not blind the man you hated? Why not go mad, go gibbering through the town like a loon, waving your hands, tearing your hair? There's nothing to stop you, or rather, anything could stop you. Any hour, any minute, that feeling, that's the real difference in a life. People who live on solid ground underneath safe skies know nothing of this. They're like the English POWs in Dresden, who continued to pour tea and dress for dinner, even as the alarms went off, even as the city became a towering ball of fire. Right? I see you shaking your head. So I'm not advocating for an insurrection, but I was really interested in the way that, in the different ways that people experience precarity, how people are disproportionately impacted by disasters, who's left out of the narrative. And like, we don't even have to really look very far, right? Like the pandemic is a perfect example of how people are impacted and experiencing things in really different ways. And so I wanted to create an exhibition around this passage because in difficult moments, I find myself often looking to artists. I think that they're really good at documenting and exposing and visualizing concerns. And maybe this is leaning on artists like a little bit too much, but I think that sometimes they can help us find solutions. And so this exhibition, we sort of narrowed the focus to 3 artists that are working in really different media in different ways. But I think there's certainly some conversation around clarity, responding to the current moment. And I think a big part of the connection I see in the artist's work is exploring the current moment through a consideration of the past. And that sort of cyclical nature or connection of the past to the present, I think in some conceptual way, it made me think about this Zadie Smith, about this quote that this sort of resurfaced and maintained relevancy to me repeatedly over the last decade or however many years. Whatever the topic, I sort of could go back to this quote. And I think it just reinforces that idea of the cyclical nature of history, not learn from our mistakes of the past. So I wanted to start by having both of you talk about your work in the show and maybe keep in mind a couple of the overlaps, including that sort of the cyclical nature connection of the past to the present. But some other connections I saw in your work, you're both using archives, and Allison is using historical document and research as well. 2 of you in particular, the series in the exhibitions, even though that's not necessarily true for all of your work, the works in this show start with documents in the 1960s, right? Like long considered one of the most tumultuous times in our country. Hồng-Ân, you're also using some current documents, so sort of pairing. You are both using text as both subject and medium, and I know, Bethany, you say that a lot about your work. It's not always true for you, Hồng-Ân, but in this case, more than half of the works are really text as image. And then I think a couple of other things, the obscuring or redacting, an element of revealing, and there's definitely ambiguity. And maybe that's with Bethany, the obscuring or redacting, and then revealing certain things. It's true for Allison, Hồng-Ân. I think it's true for your work as well, that there are sort of sentence fragments that you're only giving us a little bit of the story. So who wants to go first?
Well, I was going to just volunteer to go ahead and share the screen so that we could look at the images.
Perfect.
Okay. Should have had that up probably.
It's fine. Hopefully people have seen the show or will get to see the show. So Bethany, do you want to start since your works are on the screen?
Yes. Oh, I was waiting for the, okay, yes. I would love to. So all the works in the exhibition are from my Southern Review series, the Southern Review. This is a literary journal that's been published since the 30s, brief break for World War II, and it is ongoing today. Writers tend to know it. Visual artists, I'll say, I hope I'm not the only one, maybe less known, but it is a very prestigious journal. Similar to like the Paris Review, there are others. It doesn't have an intrinsic tie to the South, but it's published here. And so it's, the name is a little bit deceptive, but interesting for me because it feels like a way to think about, you know, can we review what it means to be Southern, which is how I'm often using the text. So I'm originally from Alabama. When I moved to New York for a residency at the Studio Museum, people were often coming through for studio visits and they would read a little bit about my biography. And it happened enough that I started to remember the question, which was people would come in and they would say, oh, how does it feel to be a Southern artist living in New York? And Southern is never something I have called myself. It's still a really kind of, the term doesn't feel like it quite fits. I'll say that my work is rooted in the South, that when I go back home and work on projects in Montgomery or Birmingham in particular, that it reminds me of why I'm working. I wouldn't make the same work if I had not been born and raised in Montgomery. And yet Southern to me, when you say the term, I think of a body that mine does not fit within. It's white and it's male, and the term doesn't work. And so I wasn't sure how to respond to that question. I'm not a good first responder. It takes me like the second or third time. It's that repetition of the asking that by the third time, I feel like, oh, okay, I should probably formulate something because I'm going to keep hearing this question. And so the work became, I'll take these Southern reviews, this review of the South, what does it mean to be Southern, and rip apart the pages. I'll edit the work and choose which pages I want to remain. And then I'll fill in the body of each page's text with this it's a very silky, rich kind of charcoal. You know, by the time you're finished working with it, it's in the air, it's all over your hands, it's all over the body, it's all over the page. And I'll fill in the body of each page's text. Everything else is untouched. So titles remained, footnotes, captions, page numbers, everything is left legible except for that body. And that became a way for me to respond to the question, how does it feel to be a Southern artist when my body doesn't feel like it fits within that term? I'll change the way we're thinking about the narrative. And by the time the work is done, you have to read that, review of the South. What does it mean to be Southern? You have to read that narrative differently. What does it mean to belong to the South or to be daughter of the South? What is that kind of inheritance? When I first started making these works, I was like throwing away the messy pages. Anytime the paper would rip or my fingerprints would get across the page, I would throw that away. And then I realized that was the good stuff because that's another way of inserting myself into the narrative. Like if I don't fit in the narrative, maybe the question needs to shift. And usually I'm working with issues from the 80s, but for this exhibition, this was the first time that I used some of the journals. It's a quarterly journal. So some of those quarterly issues from the 60s. Is it 60, 65 to 69, I think. So this moment of national crisis, or the last moment of such a national crisis, and it felt like the world, like ground was shifting beneath us. It's a kind of return to that moment and a kind of hearkening back. a kind of like chorus through history, right? I often think of digging through the archive is a way to understand now. If you can find something that feels like it is a chorus that was sung then, and it feels like there is an echo of that now, it is a way to understand this present moment. Maybe I'll stop there. Yeah, I'll trade off.
Sounds good. I love that quote of a chorus sung then and now. Okay, Hong-Ân, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I love this one, Truth and Lies. I just was thinking about the piece of mine that has the text, Truth is not an abstraction, which I didn't realize there was connection because I actually haven't been able to see the show yet, but I hope to come this week. But I'm sorry, I was just like enjoying each of the pieces, but we can go back to look at these. Bethany, I should have told you, since I'm in charge of the PowerPoint, that you could have told me to move forward or move backward. But we can go back to these as the conversation goes on so that we can spend more time with them. And these are Allison's works. Okay. I'll just talk really quickly about my project overall. Some of the pieces in the show are drawn from this larger project called We Are Beside Ourselves, which is a long-term project that I've been working on since 2018 and is ongoing and is still not finished, and has a few different sort of bodies of work within the overall project. And the project overall, We Are Beside Ourselves, is returning to the 1960s and 1970s archives, looking at moments of, there's a couple things that I'm sort of thinking about. Is one particularly the Asian American power movement, and looking at this moment of these sort of eclipsed kind of public events that Asian Americans and their sort of the work that Asian Americans were doing to come into a kind of political consciousness and a kind of political identity, and the use of that term Asian American. And thinking about all of the moments that were kind of elided or made invisible within the larger political narratives around the 1960s and 1970s. And I think, just to kind of like, I'm so glad you read that passage, because I was thinking about, thinking about that book, and just like how so much of that book is about, like, what you're saying about the precarity, and how the shared experience essentially of that precarity, right? And that being the sort of common ground. And really that is sort of what united all of these struggles in the 1960s and 70s. But yet the grand narratives that have emerged really are so singular, right? They kind of really atomize and kind of really, like the rest of sort of, kind of the ways that, kind of consumer culture and capitalism works, it kind of really like partitions, and partitions history, and kind of makes it neater for us, for like a general public to kind of understand, rather than really trying to stitch together the really complicated histories that have brought us to that point, to our point now, right? And thinking about the ways that past is really like, our understanding of it through those master narratives are actually quite simplified and really reductive, and don't give us the fuller picture, which I think prevents us from really understanding how to move forward, right? It's like we're constantly repeating these things. And so part of returning to these archives is to kind of put in conversation these histories that aren't typically narrated together. So the images of Asian American activism and the power of that moment of collective agency across the Asian American power movement, the Brown power movement, and the Black power movement, and the Indigenous power movement, were moments that were really powerful then, but yet get completely eclipsed, right? They don't get talked about together in our popular imagination. So a part of the project, the first really main pieces that I made were these carbon transferred prints on mirror, which are images from the archives that I found that were just these striking images that were like so powerful to me, and like, why aren't these images more well known, right? This is kind of what I was sort of thinking about and looking for when I was looking through the archives and thinking about these, and trying to like pull and decide which images to print, was really kind of looking at these moments that were really powerful in what they articulated in terms of these bodies, Asian American bodies being sort of so public, right? Which is not something that we normally would see. And then secondly, thinking about these moments of intimacy, this phrase of "we are beside ourselves" is sort of like both an emotional state, but also like a physical state, right? Like, we are beside ourselves. We are literally outside of ourselves. We're standing next to ourselves in relationship to another. So it's really, I'm thinking about this sort of relationality and the ways that we can understand ourselves in relationship to another. So for example, well, let me just go back to this one. So this image is an image of a funeral kind of protest after Bobby Hutton was murdered by the FBI in 1968 in Oakland. And this was organized by high school students in Oakland, California, an Asian American, a majority Asian American high school in Oakland. This image here is one that I always knew that I wanted to return to. Like, I discovered this, I mean, I came into my own consciousness about this image in my 30s. And this is an image of Yuri Kochiyama, who was a radical activist in the US of Japanese descent, who was Malcolm X's comrade, a member of his party. And this is actually the image of Malcolm X as he lay dying. And Yuri Kochiyama was the last person who held him as he lay dying. An image that has been eclipsed from our popular memory. One, because these images are actually really tightly controlled, so they're not allowed to be reproduced. I actually didn't have permission to produce the image. I tried many times, but it was like kind of, actually didn't ever get a no. I just got like basically non-answers, but
no answer equals yes.
equals, artistic liberty. So this is just like an excerpt of the larger image. So the images that were produced in Life magazine was this very big spread of multiple images of the scene. And I didn't want to kind of sensationalize it, but I did want to just sort of like focus in on this very intimate moment between Yuri and Malcolm. And in the one kind of popular image that we have of his death by Spike Lee in his film Malcolm X, this scene is replaced, Yuri Kochiyama is replaced by Betty Shabazz, his wife. So that erasure has been talked about a lot in sort of scholarly articles and books in terms of, why that happened and sort of that the kind of impetus to need to kind of make this story cleaner, right? Yuri Kochiyama kind of makes it messy, makes it too messy, right? In terms of that history and that relationship. And so I was interested in sort of thinking about these moments where, one, these really important facts and also events become kind of like are framed in a certain way for public consciousness. So I'll go quickly into these ones, so not to talk too long, because I know there's more questions, but the second body of work that's in the show are these new pieces that I finished in 2022 that are these etchings on two-way mirror plexiglass. And these are text-based so it's two-way mirror where you can see through the mirror, and it's kind of this shaded pink that you can see. And on one side of the mirror is an excerpt of a text that is from the archives from the 1960s and 70s, actually specifically mostly from the 1960s, that are from the journals and different kind of ephemera from the Third World Liberation strike and the attempts to create a third world college at UC Berkeley and at SF State in 1968 to 1969. So UC Berkeley and SF State have great archives of all of this period. And there are these amazing notebooks of the organizers and their written notes about their strategy and planning. So I excerpted some phrases from that alongside some other kinds of like communiques and newspaper, like kind of phrases from newspaper articles that were from newspapers that they would produce around the strike. So this one says, if demands not met, we'll take action. And then on the other side of it is TA strike demands. So the other side of the plexi are excerpts from the archives at UNC Chapel Hill around the tearing down of the Confederate statue Silent Sam, which was a 2-year, I mean, really like a 50-year plus battle from students and faculty over the years, over the decades, but really came to a kind of crescendo from 2017 to 2018, really, or 2019, those years. So there were multiple actions and events, and that also had ephemera. You know, it was interesting kind of going back because so many things were digitized. We were making flyers on our computers. There's such a security culture now, which is so interesting that there's no notes, right? Like we don't take notes like that, really. We don't put them out. So interestingly, I mean, there are paper notes, but nobody's, you know, like, yeah. So a lot of the flyers are kind of digital flyers that were created. And so some of the, so it's interesting also just sort of the handwritten versus some of the text. So this is one that says promise worth shit on one side from the 1960s. It's very hard to see. It's like I make very unphotographable work sometimes. But anyway, the other side you can see a little better, leave class, ditch work. So I'm kind of like putting these two things next to each other, these two moments where both the language feels really like has a resonance with each other, but also just sort of thinking about the same kind of struggle on these two different campuses in these two different moments and kind of putting them in relief next to each other to sort of think about both literally the strategy, but also this sort of dissonance or this sort of like uncanniness and kind of this sort of, for me, a profound sense of reflection, right? That we're actually in a continuous moment. It's not actually a different moment. We're like kind of continuing on the same struggle, right? I think and that's sort of one of the things I think about in my work is sort of how to make work that allows us to see ourselves in the present as a part of like stitched together. It's actually not just sort of like this looking back in these sort of epochs that get neatly kind of segmented or fragmented for us, but actually that we're in a continuous moment. And that I think is really important for us to be thinking about as we think about the ways that we continue to struggle. Silence is betrayal, is the name of this piece. And then on the other side, it's very hard to see is do not talk. It's this other flyer that we made that was basically around not talking to the cops. So it's interesting kind of like play with sort of thinking about silence versus not silence, or how we think about silence in political movements. And then this one, which I love, the strike is still on, and then strike down Sam. And then this last one, which the piece I was saying in relationship to Bethany's, truth is not an abstraction. It's this longer phrase about truth and how we understand truth. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that and kind of helping people understand the works in the show. I wanted to talk a little bit more about archives. Since you're both using them and you're pulling in, in this work, Bethany, you're sort of working from a limited archive that you're working from a particular publication. But in your other works, you're often kind of digging in to archives. We've done that work together at Davidson before. Hong-Ân, you mentioned both the archives at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, and also, you know, kind of your own archives for this personal activist work that you've done at UNC. How do you know what you're looking for? How do you approach an archive? And then I guess, like, how do you know when you found it? Like, what is it? Bethany, do you want to start since your work is on the screen? And it doesn't have to be particular to this project, since you kind of talked about what you were looking for in the Southern Review.
I mean, I think I am often looking for, I think my practice is built on repetition, and repetition as a tactic to, it's like a tactic to transform. You can say it enough times that it loses meaning. It can lose its origin text. You can say it so many times that it becomes sacred, but both of those, like loss or addition, whatever the result is, the shared effect is that the text is transformed, and that it offers us a kind of potential for transformation too. Repetition. And so the archive is a way to find those threads between the past and the present. It's also this like tantalizing, it's the proposition that you can know everything, right? That if you have a really good dictionary from the 1980s, that you can understand the world at that moment. If you have our language from a time, then there's the possibility that you know everything we value or don't value, what we leave out, what we add, how we give context. It says everything about who we are as a people. The work that comes to mind that's, you know, not in the show, but thinking about archives or my interest in an archive, this is a kind of metaphorical archive then. The first time that I used a text that wasn't from, you know, from way back was a pattern or practice. This is the Department of Justice report on the police department in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown's murder. That text then, you know, there was a lot of like anticipation before it was released. Like, would it tell the truth? How much would it say? What would it cover up? And when it was released, there was a professor in St. Louis who said reading that report was like being told that water was wet. And on the one hand, it's like, oh, it's so obvious. And on the other hand, thank goodness you didn't say it wasn't. At least it told the truth. In this one document, then, that you can have this very much kind of systematic laying out of all the reasons that lead up to a moment. So really, it's a painful document, and it's also a really beautiful document in the way that it very bluntly lays out all the reasons for a thing. And I think that's my interest in the archive, whether that's a literary journal or a Department of Justice report or a dictionary from American Heritage from 1982. Like, can you tell me everything, all the reasons that make the world this way now? It's possible. That's like the beautiful proposition. It's also, you know, it's improbable. I mean, this is also my interest in language as a whole. If we know the same, if we can like find the same words, there is nothing that we cannot know about each other. There's nothing that we cannot understand and communicate about. And at the same time, language is an extension of us. It's very human. It's very fallible. It's imperfect. It's just bound to fail. It's going to fall apart as we do. And so that, you know, that potential and the inevitable failure, I think that's inherent in the archive as well. It never tells the whole truth, but I'm really interested in those moments where it gets as close as possible to telling all the truth it can. Yes, that's often what I'm looking for. Moments where it feels like it's so close. And then it'll never work. And the work then, I think, is always embodies those two capacities simultaneously. Did that make sense? Felt like a long-winded way to get at that question.
It did make sense. I'm thinking about sort of like the aha moments too. Like for you, so much of the work is so poetic, and you mentioned the word chorus. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about like when you hit it, but I guess it depends on what the project is, right? Like, do you often approach an archive with a project in mind? And or does the archive sort of lead you to the work? Does that make sense?
So there's a body of work that's based on these classified ads that were published shortly before the end of the Civil War, all the way up until the 1920s, by formerly enslaved people looking for their family. Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia, and then Villanova University, they're digitizing these ads. Both of those, I think, are in Philadelphia. So I know going into that archive that I was looking for the ads, also based around, having Heather Williams' scholarly research in her book, Can You Help Me to Find My People? Like, I knew I'm looking for the ads. In the moment of like reading the ads, though, oftentimes it feels like a way to get through really difficult text is to look for the chorus. It helps me to like thread, it helps me to thread the past and the present, like then and now, but it also feels like a balm, So in these ads, not everyone was literate at the time. Not everybody was getting the paper. These classified ads would be published in at least like 6 Black newspapers across the Southeast, all the way up into the Northeast. But ministers would read these ads from the pulpit, I think typically after their services, in the hope of reunifying more families. That you would hear something that you think, maybe it's a nickname, the former plantation, former owner, some sort of like scar or identifying mark. You would hear that. And if it wasn't you, then maybe you could help someone else find their people. What's interesting to me in those ads is the way that, because you're hearing it over and over again, it becomes a chorus and people start to ask in the same way. So within those ads, people would start to repeat, can you help me to find my people? Have you seen her? Have you seen him? I last saw him in Mississippi. And that becomes a way for me to organize the work, to organize the past, that repetition as a kind of organizing structure. It also feels like, I don't know if this makes sense, but it feels like balm, that the more you say it over and over again, it's not one singular person saying a thing. There's something about the collective in there, and the collective understanding of a moment. And so at least you're not alone. That's what I'm looking for. Often it's that chorus and repetition, and the poetry is in there. It's not always beautiful, but it kind of acts as a salve, I think, for some of that text that is just brutal.
Yeah, thank you. Hong-Ân, do you want to talk about archives? You've talked a little bit about, so this series came out of a residency, right?
Yeah, well, the new series with the Mirror did because it was working with the materials from UC Berkeley and SF State. Yeah, so those pieces came out of that. I'm just still thinking about Bethany's response. A lot of what you just said, Bethany, resonates with me too. I think part of it too with the archive, and of course, every project is different, but generally speaking, I think there is that same tension of just what has the archive left out, but yet what can be, in a way, what can be claimed, in a way that is, I think you're using the word salve and balm as this kind of as a kind of process of somehow, what am I trying to say? There's a powerful move in that, right? That is for us, for me, for that process. And I think that's the same for my work as well, in kind of going to these images and going to the archives in a way what you're looking for. I mean, of course, the SF State and the Berkeley and the 60s and 70s archives are really different, because that's an archive that's kind of already for us, right? It's documenting a history, a political history that is our heritage, a heritage that I would acclaim, right? And so going to those, there is always this sense you are kind of looking for these repetitions, you're looking for these reverberations that feel like there's a kind of resonance. I mean, specifically with those texts, there was, reading some of those documents and, these handwritten notes and these articles and communiques that these art activists were going to, that they were writing, there's just this like really powerful feeling of just like, everything was at stake and truly people had nothing to lose. And it was just like all or nothing. People were willing to die for it. And that feeling really resonated with the feeling that I think I had and many people have had over the last like decade of work. You know what I mean? And so there's that repetition of that feeling, and that the way that those phrases and those words really connected these two moments. But in other ways too, I do think that, this project and a lot of my work, I think, is about creating our own collective kind of material history that actually hasn't been made yet, or that isn't visible or isn't present, so I'm just thinking about like a lot of the other work. I mean, going into archives around Vietnam and the history of colonial war in Vietnam, like a lot of times when I'm going into the colonial archives, it's like I'm kind of like searching for my family. There's always this feeling like, oh God, like, is my grandma gonna be in this picture, of just these random nameless faces. So there is this kind of feeling of like constantly searching for oneself in the archive and somehow being able to wrest it from that, from this, from the violence of the colonial archive, taking it from those jaws and kind of shaping it into something new and for me, for us. So I think that that feeling is still kind of there, even across the different archives, when you're kind of reshaping it and kind of recreating it, there's this sense of creating it anew and making it a new kind of material history that's reshaped and reformulated.
So I don't want to hog all the questions. If folks in the audience have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But maybe while we wait for that, I can ask one more. And I wanted to ask you about the use of mirrors in the work. I think reflection, mirroring, it comes up in your work. It also comes up in Allison's work. But can you talk specifically about using the mirrors or reflective surfaces, and also the pink? I know pink is used in other works of yours as well.
Sure, I will just go really quickly. So mirroring is something that I think about and have used a lot for a long time, either mirroring or literally mirroring or doubling or mirrors themselves physically. And I think for this work in particular, partly in general, like mirrors to me are great because I'm really interested in trying to think about the position of the audience and the viewer in looking at the work. And the mirror is an obvious kind of way for that. But I think also the doubling and the framing of it is, I want there to be a constant sense that the image is a reframing, is a literal, it's not not looking at the image itself, but constantly that the viewer is aware of the fact that it's been reframed for them, or it's represented in a way, right? So you're constantly, like the viewer, I want the viewer to be constantly aware of that kind of the context that I've given them. And so with this work in particular too, there's literally the mirror in the way that they're framed. I'll just go to them really quickly. Is, they're quite small. This is 8. It's an 8. The image itself is 8.5 by 10, or 8 by 10 actually. Sorry, it's 8 by 10, I believe. Now that I'm thinking about it, it's 8 by 10, like a regular photographic size, and it's doubled. So the image is very intimate, and they're framed in a way that kind of evoke a kind of family photograph, like on a mantle, right? With like this, kind of framing. So I wanted to evoke that sense of like the family photograph. Like this is not a public image that's been, kind of reinserted into a kind of public memory or history, but really like a kind of more intimate archive that is like a kind of, a kind of more intimate archive that I'm presenting. And then the mirror, so the mirror itself is a way to reflect that, reflect you. So it's a little bit of a way of obscuring and kind of refracting that act of looking, and the doubling of the image to be sort of thinking about that double of the image in history. And then also reflects back the different work that's in the space as well. And initially, I was really interested in having this work, which I'll show really quickly, which isn't in the SOCO show, but this piece here, which is this image of these Asian American women who were a part of Ghidra magazine from the 1969 to 1971, this magazine out of LA. I really wanted this image to be reflected back kind of in the mirror as kind of like, whatever is behind you, like history's like kind of like there's another image, or like something's sort of, there's a ghosting presence that you can't ignore, whatever direction that you kind of look, either itself or that image behind. So there's a kind of way of trying to like create yet another layer of looking, of images on top of images that continually kind of create a multiple layers of like looking that you have to contend with as a viewer. And then quickly the pink. So I have used pink in another project of mine. The very first thing that I kind of made, looking at the 1960s and 70s, a project that I made in 2017, that's not part of this project overall, but and I was drawn to it because it's a bit of a garish color, but it's one that I associate actually with Vietnam and with Asia as like a kind of plasticky kind of like, it's not classical and it's not traditional, which is what I was kind of drawn towards, but it kind of reminds you of like consumer culture and kind of commercial objects. And in Vietnam, there's just like a lot of really bright colors, including like bright turquoise and bright pink. And turquoise is another color that I've used. So I really liked the fact that it was kind of non-traditional, but to me, and perhaps to other people who have been to Asia and Southeast Asia, that the pink would kind of signify that in a different kind of way. So in a way, I'm kind of wanting to destabilize that, destabilize sort of also looking at, sort of bodies that signify as Asian, right? So not sort of these classic colors of like yellow or red, or, yellow and red are kind of the main ones that we associate with through like the Lunar New Year and things like that. So I wanted to kind of use this color that would destabilize the viewer's perception of the past and the present, of just like this very contemporary and almost like consumer culture color that you wouldn't necessarily associate with sort of archival imagery in history. That's kind of a short answer.
Is it always the same pink?
It's slight variation. So I couldn't really find the exact pink. So, this pink is not exactly the same pink. It's a little bit pinker actually than in the images. It does kind of pop out a little bit more closer to this, but it's not exactly the same pink. But I kind of look for like it's like a hot pink.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a question in the chat that I wanted to ask, which gets a little bit, gets at one of my questions a little bit. What are some of the creative conflicts or challenges you each face through your process? And Hồng-Ân, when I was thinking about this as one of my questions, I was thinking about the complication of speaking about a situation at the institution where you work, connecting to UNC and some of the things that you saw as sort of failures on the part of your institution, but someone else also had that question. So I don't know who wants to take it. You want to start?
Yeah. So it's challenges. I mean, honestly, that I don't really care what UNC thinks of me. So I don't even actually doesn't even register, they, Yeah, so actually that wasn't really a challenge in sort of like going back to that archiver there, you know, this feels very innocuous compared to like other things that they could get at me for, you know. So I mean, not to belittle or to like demean like the what I feel is like meaningful gesture in what I'm doing with the work, but in terms of the work itself, it's not, I didn't necessarily come across like, you know, institutional problems per se in that. But I do think that, you know, one of the problems, I don't know, I think for me, like, it's a huge project and a huge topic. So I'm constantly like, this is what, you know, projects take a long time, and I kind of return, and like, nope, it's not enough. Nope, there needs to be this aspect to it. So I think that's like a big challenge of like working with archives. They're so huge. There's so many things that you could be thinking about and different ways to frame it or different directions to take it. And I think that it feels like a constant challenge of the work, of, you know, kind of trying to both, you know, really like get at this very big thing, but also stay specific so that the work can be grounded, you know, which the work needs to be specific in order to have a texture that's in a way for people to enter it. But then it is a really big time period and a big topic. So I'm also, you know, that feels like a big challenge to kind of balance that.
Bethany,
Will you tell me the question one more time?
what are some of the creative conflicts or challenges you faced through your process?
Well, I'm working on the lapsed hymnal in a series. Yeah, I think this answers this. So I've been working for a while with contrafacta. They're songs that contain where the melody stays consistent, but the lyrics are rewritten over time for different political causes. So Star Spangled Banner, for instance, between the 18th and 20th centuries, there's 100 different versions of the Star Spangled Banner. You would hear the same tune, but the lyrics have been rewritten for labor unions, native sovereignty, suffrage, lots of temperance and prohibition versions. The Confederacy has their versions, as do the Union Army and abolitionists. I'm often then binding all of those versions together into a kind of reformed hymnal, so that these 100 versions of what it means to be American and to sing your patriotism to this country, like 100 dissenting versions of what it means to be American, are bound together forever, kind of in opposition often to one another. So I've worked with Star Spangled Banner, My Country to Thee, Dixie for a separate project with Davidson, and now I'm on to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And the more I work with these songs, I don't know if it's the more I work with the songs and researching these versions, or if it's the time. Like in 2022, I feel quite different than the first hymnal that I made in 2017, 2018. And I am less interested in, when I started it, I wanted there to be, like, it was important that the Confederate versions existed alongside the abolitionist versions. When we did performances of the work, it was important that both of them be sung, because that's the only way to give an accurate representation of our like real history. Is that really what we thought? Let me not use the we there. What people thought was was patriotic at the time is often in opposition to one another. That's accurate. I'm less interested in that these days. And so I'm making the last hymnal, and every time I come across a version, like a Confederate version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I'm like, I don't know if this is worth it to me to put this in. Is accuracy really what the point of this last hymnal is? Or maybe it's about a kind of, you know, maybe I just want all the suffrage versions. Maybe I want all the abolitionist versions, and that's okay. Because accuracy, like trying to make us reconsider a more accurate version of history, doesn't seem to have gotten us very far. Does it make sense? Or maybe the balm for myself is just, these are the ways I want to remember these are the songs I would rather sing. And maybe it's as simple as that. I'd rather sing these versions. Does that make sense? That's the challenge. So how many accurate versions do I include, or can it be my own kind of a faith in a future that I would like to see?
I think that's the role of the artist in a lot of ways, right? To make those decisions and to look forward, right? Like how many times do we contextualize the Confederate monument with something else? Why don't we just build the new thing we want that is, more about the future we want? There's another question, and then maybe this is the last one because we're close to our hour mark. The question is, I often feel that group exhibitions offer the opportunity to see my work in new contexts. Could each of you talk about how this show revealed new ideas, perhaps about your own work or other artists' work in the exhibition?
Can I answer with a question?
Yes.
So I saw the exhibition. I was really interested in the way that you like made my body shift in order to read the work. Yeah, that you kind of it's an invitation, but it's also a kind of like forced discomfort in order to read. So to like really get in there, I don't know if I was supposed to, but I had to like put my head between the shelves. Yes, and I may have bumped something with my bun. But it's that like discomfort is something I often think about, illegibility, and to make the viewer work. Mm-hmm. For me, that's often about, there's a problem in the language. There's something wrong here. And by the time I'm finished with the work, like actually producing the piece, I want to transfer that problem back onto the viewer. I don't want to own it anymore. And so that's how I think about, my various tactics towards illegibility or making the viewer uncomfortable. It's often to get at that, but I wonder how you think about those strategies.
That was great.
That was it.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, I mean, I think just to kind of answer your question, but also just get to the question is, I think like one, what a joy and how, lucky I am to be in conversation with your work, because I've known your work for a long time and have always seen these overlaps. So in terms of strategies, obviously different sort of subject matter overall, but generally like really have been really compelled and inspired by your work too. So that's kind of always the joy of just like, yes, like finally we can be, like that moment when you're in a group show and you're like, oh, I love all this work. It's amazing. And so not necessarily the specific revelation, because it's always amazing to be in a group show with other people whose work you already know and admire. And that was this for this show, because I also know Allison's work too from a long time. So just what a joy and like what a privilege to be in conversation, to see these things and also see these different moments and different ways of approaching it. Allison's work, I mean, we're all kind of similar questions and formal interrogations, different outcomes. And that's always like this beautiful thing to see. And yeah, for I think both of us, like that question of illegibility, legibility, invisibility, visibility are questions that are core to how I think about just the work in its making, but also you put it really well. I want to transfer that to the viewer. I want for the viewer to constantly be aware of that struggle and to know the limitations of that looking, to know the framework of that looking. And so I always kind of want to make it a little bit hard, a little bit and uncomfortable, discomfort. I've done this in different ways through different projects, but that's always a core aspect of sort of then thinking about how the work gets sort of realized, is sort of thinking about the way that the viewer is going to engage with it and putting them in a position where they have to work hard to kind of think, to kind of not necessarily to enter it, but to kind of, they have to work hard in order to like start to engage with it in a way that I think is the meaningful way to engage with it, which is to have those questions about what you're looking, how you're reading it, what's missing, physically. And so I think that translates when you're like physically having a hard time looking at it, if you're, kind of struggling and sort of having to move your body, you're very physically aware of that tension between what you know and don't know, and what the limitations physically of our looking and seeing.
We are at 11. I don't know if we should close out. Oh, Catherine Ann has joined us. That I appreciate you all so much and hearing more about the works and overlaps. And I so appreciate being able to work with you both and Allison on the project and with SOCO. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last remarks?
I'm just going to say hi to Sarah Elizabeth, who I see now. I just realized I could see the attendees.
Special call out.
Special call out. Thank you so much for bringing us all together, and great to meet you, Bethany. And yeah, really, thank you, Lia and Catherine Ann, for bringing us all together in this show and for this conversation.
Thanks for making my Wednesday start off in a positive way. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.